Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sovereign Lovestream.
Hello, happy Sunday, everyone. Thank you for
Happy
joining
Sunday.
us this week. After our short break last week, we are back and happy to be here with you all.
We took a little bit of a break for Father's Day because we went and spent the day in Jersey with family, and that's actually what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, it was an interesting week. After having not seen Danny's family for a few weeks, a few months actually, we were going back in, and there was a little bit of tension around the whole event. And it turned out to be a really fantastic day, and we thought it would be helpful to perhaps share some of these tips. Maybe others are having similar experience and have anxiety over seeing family members, especially after, a lot of us are away from our families during the whole pandemic. Kind of coming back together can be a bit of a stressful situation. And so we're here to just share a few tips that helped our situation. And obviously, it's not like a universal cure-all for everybody's situation, but it is absolutely it helped. It worked for us. So
Yeah.
here we
So,
are.
just a little bit of background. Me and my dad and my brother, my mom had passed away, and me and my dad and my brother, sometimes it's not that we have a bad relationship. We don't. There are times though when it can be a little tense. We all three of us have very strong, dominant personalities, big personalities, and sometimes we're kind of competing for airtime, if you will, at the dinner table. So, the way our family has always been, my grandparents always had us over every Sunday for Sunday dinner. It's kind of like an Italian thing. I'm sure other families, other cultures do that as well. But it was pasta at grandma's every Sunday, and that's how we grew up. And so a couple of years ago, when my grandparents passed away, we tried to continue that. Not every Sunday. That's kind of like where we fell off. So now we really only see each other for holidays. We don't do that anymore. And I think that's the reason why, because it's not very often, I think that's the reason why there's a lot of pressure for that. Like Father's Day, Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, there's a lot of pressure that you've got to show up and we've got to keep the family alive. Otherwise, what do we have, right? And that maybe is another story why we should probably get together more, and there should be more communication so that we're not relying on those holidays, but that's a tangent. Anyway, so we disagree a lot politically, especially. And, I know a lot of the people probably watching, especially if you're coming from the Conscious Resistance Network, we're anarchists. And so our political opinions don't jive with conservatives. In many aspects, don't jive with conservatives or liberals. And so it can be sometimes difficult to, navigate those things. And so it creates a lot of tension. It creates a lot of tension in my family, especially. And I think that the politics is really just the symptom, right? That's just how the anxiety manifests. I think the real anxiety is that we probably all subconsciously or even consciously feel like we're not really close anymore since my grandparents passed. And again, we kind of rely on holidays and getting together and doing the Sunday dinner. But what ends up happening, and Vanessa can kind of testify, is that those anxieties, because we're not being vulnerable about our feelings and that we miss each other or that we feel like we want to be closer, we don't communicate that. And so those anxieties kind of bubble up and explode over the political discussions, right? And maybe you want to talk about how, like, from an objective perspective, like what kind of happens.
Yeah, I think there are, like Danny said, a lot of issues in that. There's not that much vulnerability, and because perhaps because they're not seeing each other as often, not having when you don't see each other for a long time, it kind of gets a little difficult to jump right into the real issues that you're going through in the moment. You kind of talk about the superficial stuff like the weather,
what's going on with COVID or Trump.
Exactly. And so these kind of topics end up coming up, and somehow it gets, there are miscommunications. There are definitely issues with we all speak different languages in some way. Yeah, we all speak English, but the way we communicate is very different. And if we're not in contact with each other every day or very often, when we do come together, a lot of things are misunderstood. There are misunderstandings regarding a tone or like just a slight comment. I mean, if you're on the internet all day and you're arguing with people regarding their political beliefs, you'll make a snarky comment because that's what you're used to expressing with your friends, but perhaps that's something that your dad or your brother might take as, why does he have to be so snarky about this? And to Danny, perhaps that's not a big deal because he's talking to people all day every day about this type of situation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, perhaps they don't know that that's the way he communicates or that he's joking about it. And so it becomes, it's really difficult at times to watch things escalate. We can come in and say hi and be happy to see each other, and then it just takes one comment and things start escalating, and it's back and forth, and you always see this or you always see that, or because they don't speak on a consistent basis, perhaps there are ideas that we have of their beliefs and we don't know if they've changed. So we make he'll make a snarky comment about, because you believe this or that, and then maybe his dad will be like, that's not true, I don't believe that at all, and then it turns into an argument over a topic that has nothing to do with the actual conversation, and it just goes crazy out of hand.
And I will admit that probably a lot of the responsibility falls on me, because here I am, I'm the outlier, right? My brother and my dad is more politically committed, I guess, to an ideology than my brother is. So I think that for me, I come into it, I go to family dinner thinking I'm going to convert them to anarchists. I'm going to wake them up, And so I think a lot of times subconsciously, maybe I didn't realize it until I kind of was thinking about it as we prepare for the show. I think I intentionally nitpick. So my dad will be discussing something that Trump did or whatever, and I look for the opportunity that I can correct his thinking. I look for the flaws in his philosophy so that I can fix them, that I can bring them up. And I expect if I call him out, he's going to be like, oh yeah, you're right. That makes perfect sense. What was I thinking with my worldview? Right? And obviously it doesn't work that way. And so I think I was going into it expecting conflict, expecting we were going to get into these political arguments, and expecting that I could poke at them to change their ideology. It's totally counterintuitive, makes no sense, but whatever. That was that's the pattern that I've been repeating every couple of months. We go over there for a holiday, and that's the pattern I repeat. So I this was kind of a real profound realization that I had yesterday and today, that I'm probably really the cause. It's not even so much their ideologies, the statism or the things that I consider to be immoral. That's the problem. It's me provoking these conflicts, and in a way, I'm just kind of aggravating their feeling we have a lot less of a connection now that my grandparents are gone, because both my brother and my dad have both made comments about that, about how we're not as close since my grandparents have been gone. And I feel myself getting emotions kind of bubbling up now, thinking about that, thinking about because there really was that feeling of family and warmth and cohesion, even though back then there still was some arguing at the dinner table about politics. My dad was more of a Republican, my grandparents were more Democrats, so there was a little bit, but there was more of a feeling of kind of this cohesive family unit dynamic, whatever. So I definitely recognize that that's what my brother and my dad miss. And instead of playing to that and trying to develop that and fulfill that need, I'm like poking at them and like trying to change their politics. Silly.
But I think that there's this kind of societal belief that in order to come together, we must agree on all things. And I don't think it's just you. I think a lot of people have this idea. I'm going to go to family dinner and I'm going to bring up the issues and we're going to talk about it and we're all going to agree on come out agreeing on whatever it is that we're going to discuss. And that doesn't work, especially if you're coming in with the idea of I'm going to change their minds, because first of all, we don't really know the driving force behind anybody's beliefs unless you take the time to get to know them. Right? If you're just going to say, well, your beliefs are immoral and I don't want to hear what justifications you have, you'll never convince that person because they don't believe that you even understand why they feel the way they do, why they believe the things they believe. And I mean, for us, it was kind of recognizing that it was a bit of, we were participating in insanity, coming into the situation with the same mentality, with the same attitude, and expecting a different outcome.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again, and that is completely irrational. And silly. And we all this is a common theme, I think, among so many families. I think so many people have the same issue. So many people go in with the same thing. This time I have better arguments. This time I have, this situation is going to prove me right this time. How could they not see it? I see it, right? And it's really difficult to connect over something like that, especially when there are situations that are not always personal. If we're talking about what's happening out there in the world, what the rest of the people are arguing about, instead of connecting over our family dynamic, we're never going to move forward that way.
And that's exactly what the anxiety leading up to this was, because I had an argument on Facebook with my brother about Black Lives Matter and defunding the police. And so like now I have to go here and argue with him, and honestly I didn't even want to go. And I went back and forth a couple of times about whether I was going to go. And my dad was like feeling like, he made a comment about the family breaking up and was blaming himself, like he was a failure as a father. And I dismissed him. I shouldn't have, but I dismissed it because I was like, it's not his responsibility. I should have told him that. And I did tell him that on Father's Day. But in the moment when we were kind of making the plans, I kind of just dismissed it. Like, Dad, it's not your fault that, Jeremy is stubborn and, he won't see my point of view and and be converted, right? So
if he just listened to me, everything would be fine.
Right, and that's not your fault that he's so stubborn. Although I guess it kind of is, because my grandfather, me, my brother, and my dad are like so much alike. We're so stubborn and so like have the same kind of personality traits in a way. So leading up to it, that was kind of how I was going into it. And so I had found a video, a DVD. My grandfather had taken me and my brother to Disney World when we were kids, and I found the home movies. And so a couple of nights before Father's Day, I was showing my son the video, and we were cracking up. I was cracking up. Xander thought it was weird, but I was cracking up at my grandfather because he's such a comedian. And we were just having a really good time watching the movie, the home movies. And Vanessa was like, we should bring this to Father's Day. We should show everybody these videos. And like, we did. And we brought it and we showed the videos. And I think it just put all of us in a much more like nostalgic, like loving kind of spirit, where we were all like thinking about my grandfather and just appreciating like how funny he was. And I think it brought back a lot of that feeling of how my grandparents kind of, their love held the family together. And we just started talking, and my dad was sharing stories about when he was a kid, of things about my grandparents, things we never knew about him. I thought my dad's name was Alan. Apparently my dad's name is Alfonso. I just found that out the other day. My grandma was an off-the-boat Italian, and so I guess she named him Alfonso, but then wanted to Americanize it, I guess.
Here, and just to show everything was fine, Jeremy says he told your dad the same thing in reverse, that it was your fault, that you were too stubborn.
Well, I take responsibility for that, Jeremy. Yes, I believe you are right. To a large degree, I do think it's my stubbornness in trying to make you guys think the way I think. And I don't need to, and I shouldn't, or it would be better for me not to. So I admit my fault there.
And, we were having the conversation about this video a couple of days before going to Father's Day, and Danny was so excited just talking about the memory of it, and this was such a fun trip with my grandfather, and he was laughing about it without, we weren't watching the video in that moment, but we were discussing it, and I was like, that's the feeling that we need to bring to Sunday dinner. Not that I'm going to convince them to think my way. It's, let's talk about that. If everybody has admitted to the fact that they miss this family dynamic, why wouldn't you bring the energy or the feeling of the family dynamic into dinner?
Yeah.
Why bring something else in? And, back in March, we were in Mexico, and we did some interviews with my parents, and a whole bunch of stories came out. We even interviewed my grandmother, and she had stories that I had never heard before. And it was really fun to listen to the stories. It was interesting. You learn a lot about your parents. I learned a lot about how my dad grew up from my grandmother's stories, and I heard a lot from their own stories about what their childhood was like, and it made me look at things in a different way, see my parents in a different way, and that's so it's major. I think we kind of see our parents as these flawed individuals that make all of these mistakes, and the reasons why we are all messed up is because our parents didn't know how to raise us. But guess what? They're human beings too, and they probably were raised by parents that didn't know how to raise them, because nobody's born with a book. Nobody comes into the world with a manual, and the parents are like, oh, okay, this is what I say to this child, and this is how I treat this kid. It's all a learning process. And so to hear the things from my parents' childhood was very eye-opening to me, and I said, maybe this is, this would help your situation. Why not ask your dad to tell you stories? You have all, Danny was saying, I regret the fact that I haven't interviewed I didn't interview my grandfather before he passed, because he had a lot of great stories. And I was like, yeah, well, you have your dad. Ask him about what stories he knows about your grandparents and what stories he has, because I'm sure he has a ton of stories that, would be fun to hear. And that's the dynamic that could help change Sunday dinner.
Yeah. So, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the law of attraction, and like what you put into something, or the attention you put on something, is what you're going to get back. So here I am going to Sunday dinner acting like I'm a missionary going to, convert the heathens. And that's what was creating all of these conflicts. My dad and my brother are like just trying to have a nice Sunday dinner, and here I am thinking I'm the righteous one coming in to
fix everyone.
To fix them. Yeah, and this is so stupid. My ego's telling me this story that you're the right one, you're the righteous one, you're helping them. So I apologize, Dad and Jeremy, and I'm sorry, because I need to be an allowance for who you guys are and what your beliefs are. And if you change them, great. And if not, you know what? I love you anyway. It doesn't change how I feel about you. So I have to just let that go, let that expectation. And so this past Sunday, when I went into it without that expectation, without I'm going in there with my Bible to convert them, there was none of that pressure put on it. And what's so funny is that we're having dinner, and after we kind of had these conversations, my dad's telling us stories about my grandparents and history, the family history that we never knew. Now we're at the table and everything's a lot more relaxed, and my nephew asked a question, I don't even remember what it was, and we started talking about how the education system doesn't teach the truth about certain things. Columbus didn't discover the Americas. There were people here before that. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. It was, I can't remember his name, but it was a black inventor that actually invented the light bulb, and much of the stuff that Edison is credited with was actually discovered by Tesla, and Edison just took credit for the work because Tesla was his employee. So we started talking about that, and my dad was like, yeah, that's absolutely right. And I realized, I was like, oh, instead of focusing on and nitpicking on every little thing I disagree with, we can talk about the things we do agree on, because we probably agree on a lot more than we disagree on. So we had a really nice dinner where we talked about things. There was no fighting, no arguing, no screaming, none of that. It was a beautiful thing. And, I think a lot of it came down to my intentions, that when I changed my intentions from trying to change people to just trying to enjoy them, a lot of that pressure was lifted, and a lot of that tension and that negative kind of selfish, it really is selfish energy. Even though maybe in the greater scheme, like, it's not selfish for me to want to teach them truths or whatever that I think I have, it still was done in a self-righteous way. And so, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there was a huge lesson. It definitely took so much pressure off. And I mean, there are all these nephews at the dinner table every time we have Sunday dinner, being exposed to this yelling, to this
witnessing that dynamic.
Yeah. And
to them it seems normal, right? So arguing at dinner is going to be a normal thing for them. Now, hopefully, we can change that. And Jeremy, I hope we can commit to doing that, so that we do provide a better model for the kids.
And I mean, the kids were super excited by it. I mean,
they made comments about it.
They were like, wait, did they just agree on something? And then the second time they agree was like, wait, did they just agree a second time on something? And it became a really funny thing. It kind of became like a joke, like, oh my God, did we enter the Twilight Zone? What just happened? Yeah. But it was beautiful to see that they noticed it. That they, it wasn't just like it's sometimes we don't realize that kids absorb absolutely everything. They recognize everything, understand everything. And so to be in that situation and have the kids make these comments, it was like, wow, they noticed the difference. They felt the difference. And it's beautiful to be able to have, to provide what you guys experience as children of having this family dynamic, to be able to provide that for them.
Yeah.
And, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes in our righteousness, in our desire to convince people to think our way, we are letting go of some of the most beautiful parts of our existence, which is the family dynamic, the family unit.
Yeah, for sure. Jonah, I totally agree, but I would just say I feel like we get triggered enough that we don't need to intentionally trigger. And that's what I think I was doing, maybe even subconsciously, intentionally triggering conflicts because I thought I could, educate them, right? I wasn't looking at it as, oh, I'm being triggered. What do I need to change about myself, right? So I think you bring up an important point that when we get triggered, instead of focusing on who's triggering us and how they can change to stop triggering me, I need to focus on myself and how can I change so that I'm not going to be triggered.
Yeah. Or what is the core wound that's being triggered in that moment?
Right.
Because sometimes it's like, well, they won't agree with me. Well, why does that bother you so much? Why is it such a big deal that, your dad doesn't agree with you? And then maybe look at the reasons why. I'm looking to connect more with my dad. I want to have that connection. And when we disagree, I feel like we're not as connected. And so I need to change him so that if he agrees with me, then I'll feel we're connected. Sometimes it's just something as simple as that, but we fail to look at it when we're avoiding the triggers or we're trying to change the other person so that they'll fit into our ideas.
And I just realized another mistake as I'm thinking, as Vanessa's speaking. So after dinner, my dad smokes. He goes outside for a cigarette, and I just followed him out there, and we started talking. He starts telling me that he's reading Ayn Rand, and I'm like, yeah, Ayn Rand. Like, I should be happy that he's reading libertarian, even though I'm not Randian. Like, I don't agree with a lot of stuff Ayn Rand said. Like, the basic premise of rational self-interest, it's a libertarian concept that I think is good, right? So instead of saying, oh, that's cool, so you're learning about rational self-interest, that's great, I was like, Ayn Rand, she's this, she's a hypocrite, she's that. And I started railing on Ayn Rand. So a couple of years ago, I had given him Larkin Rose's book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which basically talks about how government is essentially a religion, that we're all equal. So therefore, government officials don't have power over us. It's all imagined. They only have power because we believe they have power and we obey them. So then I brought up that book, and I realized, I'm just realizing now, had I went in the and said, oh yeah, Dad, that's great, rational self-interest. Remember that book that I gave you? Well, instead, I was like, and you're reading Ayn Rand, but you think Larkin Rose is ridiculous. I had a perfect segue there, and I totally missed it.
Baby steps.
Baby steps for sure.
And we can't beat ourselves up over the missed opportunities or the moments where we kind of fall back into those patterns, because obviously you're not going to come in with this new mentality and be completely perfect at it. It's going to take some time,
sure,
some adjustments. There are times that some of the things that others say are going to trigger you, and it's going to like almost want to pull you right back in to that place again, and it's just a matter of practice. It's a matter of remembering what your intentions are, having clear intentions. If your intention is to connect, well, what's the best way I can connect? Not what are the ways in which I can't connect. Let me focus on those and then expect to connect with my family, with friends. And I think this applies to all relationships. The same thing happens in our romantic relationship. If we focus on nitpicking over everything that we disagree on, we'll just be arguing forever. But there are so many more things that we do agree on. And if we focus on that, it becomes easier to address the things that we don't agree on.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
Of course. And the funny thing is that here I am thinking, we've actually had this conversation before about you can kind of get sucked into other people's energy, especially if it's the pattern. So for X amount of years, every weekend or whenever we would get together as a family, we would end up arguing about politics. So now we accept that that's our pattern, and I'm blaming them. I'm blaming my dad and Jeremy. Every time I go there, I preach to them and they resist me. It's their fault. I get sucked into their energy and I start arguing. No, you idiot. You're the one who's poking and creating the conflict. So I learned that powerful lesson this week. It was a hard week for me in terms of shadow work. I had to do a lot of work and face a lot of hard lessons about my shadow self that I was in denial about, I think, to a large degree.
And I think that, yeah, those moments are very difficult, but once you start recognizing those patterns, it's easier to move out of them. It's easier to not take things as personally, because you're realizing, wait a minute, this isn't really what I want to do. It's, my defense mechanisms forcing me or pushing me to do something, and slowly you start to overcome them. I think it's a huge step to become aware of those defense mechanisms, of those ego-based mentalities, and we all have work to do. We're all doing the work on a consistent basis. We're all being triggered on a daily basis.
That's for sure.
And it's understandable. Like I said, we develop these patterns and we just accept them to be the way things are, and it can be a generational thing. Sometimes it's just, if your parents had this type of relationship, if your grandparents had that type of relationship, you just, that's just the way it is. One of the things that,
my brother likes to say, this is being a Panzella.
Yeah.
We're Panzellas, and that's never going to change. But Jeremy, I'm here to tell you, I'm working hard to change, so I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose to create new traditions, new ways of engaging, of relating with each other, and there's always room for improvement. So I don't think we have to get stuck into the way things are or the way things have been over the years.
And I think I want to do that. I'm committed to doing that because I do want my kids and my nephews to have that cohesive family feeling that I had growing up. I think it was so important for me to have that.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that so much about my grandparents and, my parents too. But providing that framework for that. And I want my kids to have that same thing, and my nephews. So, I'm committed to changing this dynamic, to not have it just for Father's Day to be a fluke where we get along one week and we're back to the old pattern. I want to continue to make sure that we continue in that direction, because I think it's powerful. And I think it's, it'll bring us all closer together. And, maybe if you try some of these, if anybody has a similar kind of dynamic like that, maybe you could take something from this, I hope. Because I feel a lot better. I feel a lot, what's the word? It just feels a lot
lighter,
cleaner, happier. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I mean, what it is a lot of times is removing the expectations, right? If we go in with this rigid view, and that's one of the things I've been learning about being in a state of allowance. When you're in a state of allowance, you don't limit the outcome. Sometimes you're like, all right, I have this expectation, this is what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna stick to this idea, and I'm gonna convince them, and I'm gonna change them, and now you have this one outcome only that can happen as a result of your strategy. When you're just in a state of allowance, anything can happen. And, the idea was to not argue, but not only did you guys not argue, you guys agreed on a lot of things. There was a lot of laughter.
Yeah.
There were a lot of stories that, I hadn't heard many of them, and there were some that you hadn't heard either. To find out that your dad's real name was not the name you know him by is a pretty big deal. And it was exciting. It was exciting to watch the kids watch their parents be little kids, and I think sometimes little kids have this idea that their parents have always been adults. They can't imagine their parents as children. So to see that was like, they were laughing hysterically, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful to enjoy that, to kind of show that side to your children too. I think sometimes we have this fear of being vulnerable even with children, and the more vulnerable you are, it's easier to relate to them. They can relate to you in some ways, because they're like, wait a minute, my dad was a little boy too, and he was acting all sorts of crazy on vacation.
And he was funny too. He does this whole bit where he's, my grandfather had this thing. I'll tell the story because it's so hilarious. At least I think so. My grandfather had this thing about going to buffets. So every night after going to Disney World, he would take us to Sizzler. And he would take fruit and breadsticks and all kinds of things, and he would take it to go. He would stuff them in his pockets and stuff. So my brother comes up with this idea. He's gonna do. I have the video camera and I'm filming him, and he's doing an America's Most Wanted episode for Louis the Fruit. Louis the Fruit, who's been caught on surveillance stealing fruit from
the buffets.
But it was this really hilarious thing. And I think it was really funny for the kids to see him acting like a silly little kid like that. I think that was great. I don't know if they mentioned it to him afterwards, or if I'll ask him. If you're still watching, Jeremy, comment if the kids made any comments about how funny that was. But I think, it helps them to get to know their dad a little bit more too.
Yeah, definitely. It puts parents in a different perspective. When I was talking to my mom, she ended up mentioning she was into sports when she was younger, and she was a runner, she was running marathons, she was a pole vaulter. I was like, what? I had no idea my mom did that. She was like, yeah, I was in the school ballet, and I performed at the town square. And I was like, I had no idea that my mom did all these things as a kid, and it's so interesting to see her in a different way. It's so interesting to remember that my mom was a little girl and had these interests and tried all of these things. Obviously I know that she was a little girl at some point, and I'm sure she, had all these interests, but it's different to hear it right from her, to know her experiences. My dad told us the story of the very first time he, I guess, the moment he fell in love with my mom. And it was interesting because we were interviewing him on camera and asking him, when he realized he was in love with her, because he grew up, they're from the same town. they grew up in the same circle of friends because my mom's brother was my dad's best friend. And so my dad used to go to my mom's house when they were little, and he was like, I remember going there to play, but I don't remember ever seeing your mom. And it wasn't till somebody at school made a comment about him like liking another girl, and my dad was like, no, I don't like her. He was like, if I'm gonna date someone, I'd rather date, you know, her, pointing to my mom. And then he was like, but then it was like I looked at her and I was like, oh my god, why haven't I seen her before, or why haven't I looked at her this way? And he described the way she walked. You know, they had been out during recess playing, I don't know if they were running or playing basketball or something, and he was like, she had all these little beads of sweat on her face, and it was so beautiful. And the way he described it was just so beautiful. He got all teary-eyed just thinking of that memory, and it's like, wow, that's such a beautiful thing for him to remember. I mean, they've been married for over 50 years now. They've been together for over 50 years now. And to have that memory and he clearly still could feel that emotion of seeing her, and that was such a beautiful thing to experience and to hear that story. I think it would benefit children to hear those stories of how their parents fell in love, to hear stories of you know, how their uncles and aunts, you know, and parents played when they were little. It just creates this different level of connection with your children. And sometimes we forget to ask our parents these stories, and I think when we ask them, when we try to connect that way, we'll discover things about them that will help make their parenting make sense to us. And then it relieves some of that pressure. So I highly recommend that. I mean, even if you don't have any family issues, I certainly have a really great relationship with my parents, but hearing these stories just change the dynamic so much. And there are moments where I'm like talking to my mom or my dad, and there are things that may irritate me, and then it's almost like I slip back into remembering these conversations, and I'm like, oh, I know where that thought pattern comes from. I remember when she told me the story that brought her to that thought pattern, and so it's not personal. That's something she's had since she was a kid, and so it's not about me. And it just changes things. There's a sudden relief, and it creates this closeness that I didn't have before.
Yeah, and it works in both positive and negative ways, right? So like when our parents trigger us, the more we know them, the more we can forgive them, right? It's easier to forgive when you understand where like a certain pattern comes from. So like my dad was saying before Thanksgiving, Father's Day, he was like, you know, I've been an absentee father and I wasn't around enough, and it's my fault that you guys don't get along that well. And I was like, Dad, I understand that, you know, you were working sometimes 3 jobs. My dad was a hard worker because his love language is acts of service. So I know that about him. I know that I can call my dad at any moment. I can FaceTime him. If I'm working on a construction project and I'm stuck, I don't know what to do, I can FaceTime him and have him look at it, and he'll talk me through it or whatever. Like, that's who he is. He's if I need help, he'll come, right? He's an acts of service kind of guy. That's how he shows his love. So I was like, Dad, I understand that about you. So I know that even though maybe you weren't around as much as we both probably would have liked, I know you probably would have preferred to be playing with us as kids than to be working that 3rd job. But we know you did that to keep us out of poverty, to make sure that we had what we needed. So, you know, don't blame yourself for that. That doesn't mean you're a bad dad because you couldn't be around as much as you would have liked to. I mean, if you didn't want to be around, then maybe you're a bad dad. But so, like, if we can understand those things, we can forgive them, right? Because I could be the kind of person that holds a grudge against him. It's like, oh, you don't give a shit about me. You weren't even around. I barely saw you when we were kids. You know, Pop-Up had to take us to Disneyland because you didn't. But I understand that my dad just couldn't afford to take us to Disneyland. As hard as he tried, as much as he worked to try and do it, he just couldn't do it. And I don't have to carry like bitterness about that. I can forgive him and say, you know what, Dad, I love you. It doesn't matter to me. And we can make up for that lost time now. We could just spend more time together now. So, and it can work in other ways too, appreciating them in positive ways, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, especially as children, maybe we don't have the understanding. And especially, I think back in the day, parents were less willing to communicate with their children about what was happening.
Sure.
It was like,
Yeah.
if I'm working because we don't have enough money, I'm not going to tell my kids that we don't have money because I don't want to worry them. I'm just going to go work. And then the kids have no idea why mom and dad are working so much.
But guess what? Your kids know.
Yeah.
When I was a kid and the oil tank ran out of oil and we would wake up one morning and freezing in the winter because there was no heat, we understood why. I mean, obviously I don't remember having bad, like, blaming my parents for that. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think I thought in those terms as a kid. You're just like, oh, this is, sometimes this happens.
Yeah.
So.
But I think it's very important to communicate to children so that there's a little bit more of an understanding, because sometimes we have reactions. Recently, this past Christmas, we were decorating the Christmas tree, and I recognized that all of a sudden I was really sad, and I remember I walked out. I was kind of cranky while we were decorating the Christmas tree, and I couldn't recall why. I didn't know why I was cranky. And we took a quick, I left to go to the bathroom, and I just started crying. And, one of the things I realized is, I had a miscarriage about 10 years ago, and I was supposed to be due in December for Christmas, and I had like all of these expectations. And so Christmas is sometimes a little bit of a bittersweet moment for me. And I had that reaction, and, I was like, all right, I'm good. I let it go. But then a couple of days later, a couple of weeks later, we had a conversation with Xander, and I brought it up, and I explained it to him. I said, there are times when I get cranky, and even I don't realize why I'm cranky. I don't realize why I'm sad. In the moment, I just felt cranky, but the truth is I was sad, and sometimes it comes off that way, and I'm sorry. And I explained to him the situation. I told him the association I made and why I was feeling sad that day. And he was like, oh, okay. And I think that's such a big thing to explain to children, why sometimes parents can be in a bad mood, or can be sad, or can just be quiet for whatever reason. That gives them the allowance to express themselves too when they're having difficult moments. And if they can see that mom and dad or Vanessa is, just as emotional at times, then it's okay for me to be emotional at times.
Yeah.
And
and to be open about the reason, to tell us, to communicate to us the reason. If we can communicate to our kids why we're having a bad day or why we haven't been around as much. I mean, I'm very open with my son about those things. Then they can feel comfortable in saying, Dad, I'm sad because you were working a lot this week and I didn't really get to see you too much. I want him to be able to tell me that.
Yeah.
And I do my best to try and schedule my work around when I have shared custody with my ex-wife. And I try to arrange my work schedule so I can be around as much as possible when he's with me. But sometimes I can't. And sometimes I do have to work on the days that he's staying with us. So, but I do communicate that, and I tell him, look, man, I'm sorry, I got to run out to work today because we need to keep the lights on here and the air conditioning running. So, and he understands, and he's sad, and when I'm gone, he asks for me and asks Vanessa when I'm coming home. But we can communicate about it, and it
there
keeps
are
it open.
times that if he's working all day and it's nearby, I'm like, all right, well, let's go bring him lunch. Let's walk over, or let's go have lunch with him. Or, we try to keep that open and try to communicate that. And it is so important to communicate those things, because as adults, we're realizing how there are minor situations in our childhood that affect us, affect our way of looking at our parents, affect the way we communicate to others, the way we relate to our partners, because of a tiny situation that happened in our childhood that we just didn't understand and we misinterpreted completely. And so I think it's so powerful to have these conversations with our loved ones to clarify these moments. If you have resentment towards your parents or towards a sibling, a family member, over something that happened many, many years ago, it might benefit you to talk about it and say, hey, when this happened, what was your thought process then? Or what were you doing when this situation occurred that cause you to behave this way, and you might just find out that it was something completely unrelated to you, and you've been holding this grudge all of these years.
Yeah. Like for me, that actually happened, I guess, on Christmas, right? It was when I had the conversation about my dad, about my mom.
Yeah.
So I had this like kind of wound or this feeling that my mom was kind of irritated with having kids, and like she had went through this period, I've discussed it on the show before, where she was like going to the gym a lot, and now I understand as a parent, she just needed some alone time, some me time. But at the time, as a kid, I was like, oh, we're like an annoyance to her that she has kids. And I asked my dad, I was like, Dad, I've been struggling with this, and I kind of have this resentment against my mom, and she passed away now. So she's been gone for 10 years. And for a long time, I carried this. And he was like, what are you talking about? She was like, he didn't even really remember that period that I'm describing. But he was like, she was obsessed with you guys. You were her whole world. So, sometimes we just as kids don't understand what's happening, and we interpret it in a way, and we carry that as truth for the rest of our lives sometimes, if we don't integrate it.
Yeah.
So communicating both with your kids and your parents and your, just your family members in general is...
Your siblings even. I think sometimes, you've had this conversation also with Jeremy, and Jeremy's like, I never felt that way about
That's
mom
right.
too.
My brother never had that experience.
He was like, no. And so it's...
And I kept telling him he was in denial. I kept saying, you just don't remember. You're just in denial. And he just didn't interpret it the same way I interpreted it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the way it was.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why these conversations are so important. Yes, of course it's important to talk about what's happening in the world, and at times when these decisions that are happening out there affect you directly, of course, you may want to have those conversations. But let's be honest, the majority of the stuff that's being talked about in the news, the majority of the stuff that's happening out in the world, there's so many things that never even get to you. It's just policymakers talking, and none of it, how much of it like fully affects you to the point where you're going to break up your family dynamic over it. Now, if it's something where there's disrespect, where where it's directly affecting you, where there's no disrespect, then obviously you can set boundaries and say, hey, I'm not willing to engage in this relationship if you don't respect my choices, if you don't respect my decisions. But if you're just arguing over what somebody said on the news, it's really irrelevant.
This actually brings up a final point that, since we're coming to the close of the show, we did want to talk about. So right now with COVID going on, everybody has an opinion. We should wear masks, we shouldn't wear masks, we should social distance, it's just a control paradigm, all of these things. And I think a lot of these views, even the conflicting ones, are valid. But it's causing a lot of conflicts even within families. We have a couple of friends who, different families who are having issues with their family members who, I guess watch the news and believe everything they're told. And so they're very cautious, and it's understandable. If you really believe that COVID is a dangerous virus, and I think it's dangerous to a portion of society, right? It's mostly the elderly and people that are already sick or immune compromised who it kills. And I think there are some young people that have died. I think they probably had undiagnosed conditions. But even Fauci now is admitting 80% of people who test positive for COVID do not even get sick. So anyway, I'm sorry, I had to throw my opinion in there. But so other people maybe don't believe that, and they just kind of see the headlines and they just think, it's dangerous, it could kill anybody, and they're really worried about their health. And honestly, if they're that worried, it probably will affect them, because stress and anxiety really lowers your immune system, and that could leave you open to COVID. So what we've been seeing is some of our friends have been having falling out with their family over this. Family members saying, if you refuse to wear a mask, or if you don't think wearing a mask is important, then I don't want you coming over, and basically, like, maybe not totally disowning, but at least saying, like, for now, I don't want any contact with you. And while this is sad, I hate to ever see conflicts like this escalate to that point, maybe it's okay to take a break and just like let the energy die down, right? Of that conflict, of that fight. And maybe just be a little bit more respectful, even if you think it's ridiculous, right? I think it's ridiculous that my dad thinks we need police in society. I think we can operate without them. But he genuinely believes we do. So I can respect that. And I can meet him where he's at, and we can just agree to disagree. And I don't have to make it an issue about that. I guess it's a personal choice for you. Are you willing to wear a mask to make your mom or your sister feel comfortable? That's a personal choice, and I don't judge it either way. But maybe a little vacation from each other is okay if you're, if that's.
Yeah,
you have anything to say about that? I'm kind of stymied here.
No, I definitely agree. There are going to be times when boundaries are going to be set and we're going to take breaks from each other, and I think that's totally healthy. Especially when you do it in a loving way. Okay, I respect your opinion. It's my choice to not do this, and if that means we can't see each other for the duration of this pandemic, we won't do that. I still love you. I still respect you. I respect your opinion. I just ask that you respect mine, and maybe we just take a short break from each other, and when things settle down, we can come back together again without any problems. And we can text, we can call, and communicate with each other. If a family member, a friend, whatever, decides, I'm cutting you off, just give them time. I really believe that this time has kind of put people on edge more than usual, but it's also been a time of reflection for so many people. And if this is a time where, for whatever reason, a break comes into your reality, then you take the break and you look at the situation. What is it about this situation that I would benefit from reflecting on? I'm taking a break from my mom or my sister or whoever it is. What about this relationship can I look at that could potentially be there? It's never just about COVID. It's never just about the mask. There's always an underlying issue. So perhaps take the time to look at what the underlying issue might be. Is it that there was already a strained relationship? Why? Where did that come from? Maybe now's the opportunity to trace it back and figure out, oh, this is really where this might be coming from. And maybe when we're ready to talk things out again, we can bring that up and discuss it and say, hey, are you still feeling a certain way about this issue? Or I'm feeling a certain way about this issue in our past. Can we maybe discuss it? Perhaps I misunderstood something, and take it from there. I think it's all imperfection, in my opinion. When we have these falling outs, there's an opportunity for something. There's an opportunity for growth. And so we just ask to not take things personally, to remember to keep your heart open and love even those that you disagree with, and take these opportunities to learn something about yourself, to learn something about them, and hopefully come together in a stronger, more connected way.
Yeah, I think for me, the most powerful lesson that I learned this Father's Day was me being right is not as important as the connections with my family or anyone else, my friends even, because I had a similar situation with a friend that was a repeating pattern, the same thing as my issues with my family, even though I didn't realize it until just this moment right now as I'm thinking about it. It's the same lesson. Me being right is not as important as the connections with my friends and family. So sometimes it's okay to just put aside being right so that we can maintain the relationship.
And sometimes when you maintain that relationship, that rapport, that empathy, it's easier for the other person to see your point of view because there's already an established connection there.
Yeah.
If you're coming at it without a connection, for example, Danny perhaps not seeing his dad as often as he would like to, and then he comes and sees him after a few months and is like, you need to see my point of view. You need to see that I'm right. His dad's going to be like, calm down. And there's no way that he could possibly want to hear him at that point. It's like, I haven't seen you in months and you're going to come yell at me that I'm wrong about something.
Now you're going to beat me over the head with your opinion.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's... that's not to say get this connection so that you can convince your loved ones, but it's more likely that you will be able to get someone to at least consider your point of view, even if they disagree with it, but to at least consider it if you've created that connection first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great place to end the stream. Thank you so much for watching. We hope that some of this, sharing these stories with you, has some value. And if you can take some of these techniques maybe and apply them to your family and improve your relationships, we would be so happy about that. If you have any questions or really even just suggestions about show topics or anything, shoot us an email. If you go to sovereignlovestream.com, you can get all of our social media there as well, and get in contact with us. We want to hear from the audience. We love the comments. We love the feedback. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Do you want to put up the social media accounts?
Sure. Sorry. So we're on all the major Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that, YouTube. I also love to talk about Minds.com and Float app, especially for those of you who are concerned about censorship and privacy. These two apps are anarchist apps. They are run by people who respect privacy. They do not sell your information or collect metadata, and they do not censor content. YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook have openly admitted they're going to be censoring stuff, especially with COVID. They've been censoring posts about vitamin C boosting your immune system. Now all of a sudden vitamins are a conspiracy theory that need to be censored. So if you're concerned about censorship, check out Minds.com or the Float app. These are two great apps. So once again, thank you for joining the Sovereign Love Stream. We appreciate you, and have a great week.
Yeah, see you next week, guys. Thank you.